In the autumn of 1996, in a peaceful suburb in Ohio, a young woman went missing without warning, and the mystery remained unsolved. Nearly 2 decades later, one small detail reopened the case, and it changed everything forever. The town of Elmwood, Ohio, was the kind of deeply insulated, quiet Midwestern community where nothing truly terrible was ever supposed to happen. It was a place defined by its sprawling green parks, quiet cul-de-sacs, and old oak trees that turned brilliant shades of orange and red during the crisp autumn months. The people of Elmwood trusted their neighbors, left their doors unlocked during the day, and relied heavily on the steady, unwavering leadership of their local police department. At the absolute center of this community was Police Chief Daniel Mercer. Daniel was a highly respected, physically imposing man in his late 40s. He had broad shoulders, a quiet, commanding voice, and eyes that had seen decades of minor suburban disputes and traffic accidents. He had dedicated his entire life to keeping Elmwood safe. He was not just an administrator in a uniform. He was a man who knew the local business owners by their first names, who attended every community town hall, and who believed with all of his heart that his town was a perfect sanctuary. Daniel shared a beautiful, comfortable life with his wife, Sarah, but the absolute center of their entire universe was their 16-year-old daughter, Claire. Claire Mercer was the bright, beating heart of the Mercer household. She was an incredibly grounded, compassionate, and intelligent teenager. While many girls her age were caught up in high school drama, Claire was focused on her future. She spent her weekends volunteering at the local library, reading thick historical novels, and planning out her upcoming college visits. She had a warm, infectious laugh and a deeply trusting nature. Claire loved her parents fiercely, and the bond she shared with her father was incredibly strong. Daniel looked at his daughter and saw the absolute best part of himself. But on a cool, overcast Friday afternoon in late October, the perfect safety of Elmwood was violently shattered, and the powerful police chief was forced to learn a terrifying lesson about how quickly a beautiful life can completely disappear. It was Claire's 16th birthday. The Mercer family had planned a quiet, special celebratory dinner at their home that evening. Sarah had spent the entire afternoon preparing Claire's favorite meal, and Daniel had managed to leave the police precinct early to help decorate the dining room. The house was filled with the warm, comforting smell of baked food and the happy anticipation of a family celebration. At exactly 4:30 in the afternoon, Claire realized they had forgotten to buy the specific brand of sparkling apple cider they always drank on special occasions. She told her mother she was just going to take a quick bike ride down to the neighborhood convenience store to pick it up. The store was less than a mile away, located on a quiet, highly familiar residential street. Sarah smiled, handed her daughter a $10 bill, and told her to be back quickly before the food got cold. Claire grabbed her favorite green canvas backpack, pulled on a light denim jacket, and wheeled her bicycle out of the garage. Daniel watched through the living room window as his daughter rode down the driveway, her dark hair blowing gently in the autumn breeze. She waved at him, turned the corner, and completely vanished from his sight. It was a perfectly ordinary, completely routine moment. Daniel had absolutely no idea that it would be the very last time he would see his daughter for 19 agonizing years. By 5:15, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the quiet suburban lawns. Sarah walked into the living room, wiping her hands on an apron, and looked out the front window. She mentioned to Daniel that Claire was taking a little longer than usual. Daniel checked his watch. He wasn't immediately terrified. He knew Claire was a deeply social girl. He simply assumed she had run into a classmate at the store and lost track of time talking. But when the clock struck 6 o'clock, and the streetlights outside flickered on, illuminating the dark, empty driveway, a tiny, cold seed of worry suddenly took root in the bottom of Daniel's stomach. Claire never broke the rules. She was incredibly responsible, and she knew exactly how important the birthday dinner was to her parents. She would never just wander off without calling the house from a payphone. Daniel picked up the kitchen telephone and dialed the number for the convenience store. The clerk answered quickly. Daniel asked if his daughter had been in the store recently. The clerk's answer completely stopped Daniel's heart. The clerk confirmed that Claire had indeed come into the store, purchased a glass bottle of sparkling cider, and left. But that had been over an hour and a half ago. The husband completely vanished, and the veteran police chief instantly took over. Daniel grabbed his heavy jacket, strapped his service weapon to his belt, and ran out the front door. He told Sarah to stay by the phone. He jumped into his unmarked police cruiser and sped aggressively down the quiet suburban streets, his eyes desperately scanning the sidewalks and the dark patches of trees for any sign of her bicycle. He arrived at the convenience store in less than 3 minutes. Daniel threw the cruiser into park and stepped out into the cold night air. The very first thing he saw sent a massive, suffocating wave of pure panic crashing entirely over his mind. Resting quietly against the brick wall on the side of the building, completely abandoned in the dark, was Claire's bicycle. Daniel ran over to the bike. It was not damaged. The tires were full and the chain was perfectly intact, but Claire was completely gone. He immediately unclipped his heavy police radio and called the central dispatch. His voice was strict and professional, but beneath the trained authority, his fellow officers could hear the raw, terrifying edge of a father's worst nightmare. He declared a massive, immediate town-wide emergency. The police chief's daughter was officially missing. Within 30 minutes, the entire town of Elmwood was completely transformed into a highly militarized search zone. Dozens of marked patrol cruisers flooded the streets, their red and blue emergency lights slicing violently through the dark, quiet neighborhoods. Heavily armed state troopers arrived to assist, setting up roadblocks at every major intersection leaving the suburb. The piercing sound of police sirens completely shattered the peaceful autumn evening. Daniel stood inside the small, cramped back office of the convenience store, surrounded by his senior detectives. They demanded the clerk play back the security camera footage from that afternoon. The grainy, black and white VHS tape flickered onto the small television monitor. Daniel held his breath, leaning heavily against the desk, desperate to see exactly what had happened to his little girl. The detectives fully expected to see a violent struggle, a terrifying predator grabbing the teenager in the parking lot, or a chaotic moment of pure panic. But what the security footage actually showed completely defied every single expectation, making the terrifying mystery deeply, profoundly confusing. At exactly 4:45, the camera captured Claire walking out of the front glass doors of the store. She was completely alone. She was holding a small plastic bag containing the bottle of cider. She did not look frightened. She was not checking her surroundings, and she was not glancing nervously over her shoulder. Her body language was incredibly relaxed and completely normal. She walked slowly toward the side of the building where she had left her bicycle. The camera angle did not cover the exact spot where the bike was parked, but the footage covering the street completely proved that no suspicious, speeding van had violently pulled up to the curb. No masked stranger had run into the frame. Claire had simply walked off the edge of the screen and vanished into thin air, looking exactly like a girl who was perfectly safe. The initial theory of a random, violent street abduction completely collapsed. If someone had violently ambushed her right next to the building, the camera would have captured a struggle, or at least a vehicle rapidly fleeing the scene. The fact that her bicycle was left perfectly standing against the wall meant she had never even tried to get on it. The detectives aggressively fanned out across the neighborhood, knocking on every single door, desperately searching for anyone who had been looking out their windows during that exact time. Hours into the exhausting search, a young patrol officer brought a 15-year-old neighborhood boy named Tommy directly to the command center. Tommy had been delivering newspapers on his bicycle just a block away from the convenience store that afternoon. Tommy stood nervously in front of the massive, intimidating police chief and told his story. He claimed that he had seen a teenage girl matching Claire's exact description, standing near the edge of the convenience store parking lot. And according to Tommy, she had willingly, calmly opened the passenger door of a familiar-looking sedan and climbed inside. Daniel leaned forward, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. He desperately pressed the young boy for details. He asked if the driver had forced her. "No, sir," Tommy stammered, shaking his head. "She didn't look scared at all. She just opened the door and got in like she knew whoever was driving." The statement completely sent shockwaves through the investigation. If Claire had willingly entered a vehicle, she had to have recognized the driver. It had to be someone she implicitly, completely trusted. But as the senior detectives gently interrogated the young witness, his story began to rapidly, frustratingly fall apart. When asked about the exact color of the sedan, Tommy said it was definitely black. Then, a few minutes later, he said it might have been dark blue. When asked about the make of the car, he completely guessed, naming 3 completely different brands in the span of 5 minutes. He couldn't remember if the windows were tinted, and he absolutely couldn't describe the driver. Because the young teenager kept constantly changing highly specific, crucial details under pressure, the senior detectives completely dismissed his statement as unreliable. They believed Tommy was simply an overactive kid trying to insert himself into the biggest police investigation in the history of the town. They officially threw the lead out, completely ignoring the one person who had actually seen Claire leave. By midnight, the heavy, agonizing reality of the situation had completely settled over the Mercer household. Sarah was sitting on the living room sofa, weeping uncontrollably, holding a framed photograph of her daughter against her chest. Daniel paced the floor, his mind aggressively tearing through every single terrifying possibility. The massive search continued aggressively through the freezing night. Tracking dogs were brought in. Helicopters with heavy thermal imaging cameras flew over the dense tree lines, and hundreds of civilian volunteers marched shoulder to shoulder through the local parks. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. At exactly 6 o'clock the next morning, as the pale gray sunlight began to slowly break over the horizon, the police radio on Daniel's belt violently crackled to life. It was the commander of a specialized search team, operating nearly 10 miles completely outside the town limits, in a deeply rural, highly isolated county sector. The commander's voice was incredibly tight, heavy with a dark, terrible dread. They had found something. Daniel aggressively sped to the remote location, his heart pounding a deafening, terrifying rhythm against his ribs. He pulled his cruiser onto the shoulder of an old, quiet county highway that crossed over a deep, rocky riverbed. He ran down the steep, muddy embankment toward the massive concrete pillars supporting the old bridge. The search team was standing in a circle, their flashlights pointed at the damp dirt. Resting quietly in the shadows, beneath the bridge was Claire's familiar green canvas backpack. Daniel completely froze. His hands began to shake violently. He knelt in the freezing mud and carefully opened the heavy zippers of his daughter's bag. He fully expected the backpack to be completely ransacked. He expected to find a violent, chaotic mess left behind by a terrifying predator who had stolen her money and dumped the evidence. But what Daniel actually found completely shattered the entire psychological profile of the case, creating a massive, horrifying contradiction that defied absolutely all human logic. Everything inside the backpack was perfectly, meticulously arranged. Her school notebooks were completely untouched. Her wallet was sitting in the front pocket, absolutely full of cash. The glass bottle of sparkling cider she had just purchased was resting safely inside, entirely unbroken. Nothing of value had been stolen. But as Daniel aggressively searched every single pocket of the heavy canvas bag, a massive, sickening chill violently washed completely over his body. The one single item that was completely missing from the perfectly organized backpack was Claire's heavy, metal ring of house keys. Why would a terrifying kidnapper steal a teenage girl, completely ignore her cash, deliberately place her backpack perfectly under an isolated bridge miles away from town, and only take the specific keys that unlocked the doors to the police chief's own home? The terrifying realization that Claire's heavy ring of house keys was completely missing from the abandoned backpack sent a massive, violent shockwave of pure panic through Daniel Mercer. He was a veteran police chief who had dealt with violent criminals for decades, but standing in the freezing mud beneath the isolated county bridge, he felt an absolute, suffocating dread completely consume him. A random kidnapper who snatched a teenager off the street for a ransom would never care about a set of house keys. But a highly calculated predator who specifically targeted the police chief's daughter absolutely would. Daniel immediately grabbed his heavy radio and called his central dispatch. He aggressively ordered 2 heavily armed patrol units to drive directly to his suburban home and completely lock down the property. He was utterly terrified that the monster who took Claire would use the stolen keys to quietly unlock the front door and ambush his deeply grieving wife, Sarah, who was sitting completely alone in the living room. Within minutes, the Mercer home was completely surrounded by police cruisers. Sarah was perfectly safe, but the psychological sanctuary of their beautiful family home had been completely, permanently violated. Daniel knew they had to follow the physical evidence immediately. He ordered the state police K-9 tracking units to deploy directly to the muddy embankment beneath the bridge. The highly trained bloodhounds were given a piece of clothing from Claire's bedroom to isolate her specific scent. The dogs immediately picked up the trail. They did not lead the search teams into the deep, dark water of the river. Instead, they pulled aggressively on their heavy leather leashes, tracking the scent directly up the steep dirt embankment and onto the paved shoulder of the rural county highway. Daniel marched closely behind the dogs, his heavy flashlight cutting through the dense, freezing fog. He desperately prayed that the dogs would lead him straight to an abandoned barn or a hidden cabin where Claire was waiting to be rescued. The dogs tracked the invisible scent along the dark highway for nearly 2 miles. Finally, they pulled the investigators into a massive, completely empty rural park-and-ride lot, a paved area frequently used by daily commuters to carpool into the city. The dogs aggressively circled a specific, empty parking space near the very back of the dark asphalt lot. They sniffed the cold pavement frantically, and then, completely confused, they simply sat down. The scent completely, entirely vanished. The senior detectives looked at Daniel, shaking their heads in heavy, devastating defeat. The trail did not fade away into the woods. It ended abruptly on the hard asphalt. This completely confirmed that the teenage witness from the convenience store had been at least partially correct. Claire had absolutely entered a vehicle. The predator had driven her to the isolated bridge, carefully placed her backpack in the mud to create a massive, false search grid, and then driven her to the rural commuter lot. At the park-and-ride, the kidnapper had completely transferred Claire into a second, completely unknown vehicle, permanently breaking the physical trail and vanishing entirely into the dark night. The massive, highly energized investigation quickly hit a brutal, unyielding brick wall. The days slowly turned into heavy, agonizing weeks. The national media completely descended on the quiet town of Elmwood, parking massive broadcast trucks on the Mercer family's lawn. Daniel barely slept, his eyes completely bloodshot as he spent every single waking hour aggressively reviewing the empty evidence files. And then, exactly 1 month after Claire disappeared, the Elmwood police precinct received a massive, completely terrifying piece of mail. It was a standard, cheap white envelope addressed directly to Chief Daniel Mercer. There was absolutely no return address, and the postage stamp was completely generic. Daniel opened the envelope in the secure conference room, heavily surrounded by state investigators. Inside was a single piece of lined notebook paper. The message was handwritten in a blocky, highly forced script. The anonymous letter claimed that the police were completely wasting their time searching the woods. The author wrote that Claire was perfectly safe, but she had grown completely exhausted by the massive, suffocating pressure of being the perfect police chief's daughter. The letter stated that Claire had deliberately planned to run away for months, and she had finally left the state to start a completely brand new life entirely on her own terms. The letter ended with a deeply cruel sentence: "Stop looking for her. She is finally free." When Daniel brought the letter home and showed it to Sarah, his wife fiercely, aggressively rejected the entire narrative. She wept with a massive, entirely uncontrollable anger. Claire had absolutely no desire to run away. She had just spent the previous weekend happily circling college campuses in a heavy guidebook, and she had already purchased a beautiful dress for the upcoming school dance. She loved her life, and she completely adored her parents. Daniel knew the letter was an absolute, devastating lie, but he also knew it was a massive piece of physical evidence. He immediately sent the anonymous letter to the highly advanced State Forensic Document Laboratory. He demanded that the linguistic experts and handwriting analysts completely tear the document apart. 3 days later, the lead forensic analyst called Daniel with a discovery that completely shattered the entire psychological profile of the case. The analyst confirmed that the handwriting was a deliberate, heavy forgery, likely written with the non-dominant hand to completely mask the author's identity. But the most terrifying discovery was not the handwriting itself. It was the specific words the author had chosen to use. The analyst pointed out 2 highly unique, deeply poetic phrases buried inside the anonymous letter. The author had written about Claire feeling like a bird trapped in a silver cage and running from the heavy weight of perfect expectations. Daniel's blood completely turned to ice. He dropped the heavy telephone receiver, his entire body shaking violently. He immediately drove to his house and ran up the stairs into Claire's empty, perfectly preserved bedroom. He opened the heavy wooden drawer of her writing desk and pulled out her private spiral notebooks. He frantically flipped through the pages of her old high school English essays. There it was, written in Claire's beautiful, flowing handwriting, in a private creative writing essay graded months before her disappearance, were those exact 2 phrases. The massive, horrifying truth violently washed over Daniel. The author of the anonymous letter had not just guessed how Claire felt. They had completely, flawlessly plagiarized her exact words to make the fake runaway letter sound entirely genuine. And the only way the predator could have known the exact phrasing of a private high school essay was if they had physically stood inside Claire's bedroom and read her personal notebooks. The terrifying mystery of the missing house keys was finally solved. While Daniel and Sarah had been miles away, frantically searching the freezing woods alongside hundreds of volunteers, the monster had completely used the stolen keys to quietly unlock their front door. The predator had walked silently through the empty, quiet house, stood inside Claire's bedroom, and completely violated her private journals to build a flawless, fake alibi. The realization completely destroyed the Mercer family's sense of safety. The kidnapper was not a random drifter passing through the town. It was someone highly calculating, incredibly bold, and entirely deeply connected to their lives. The entire massive weight of the state police investigation aggressively pivoted away from strangers and turned directly inward. The attention completely shifted toward the trusted inner circle. Daniel and the state detectives began quietly, aggressively investigating everyone who had regular access to the Mercer family. They pulled the financial records and cellular phone logs of fellow police officers, local neighborhood friends, church leaders, and trusted school teachers. The heavy, suffocating paranoia completely infected the quiet town of Elmwood. Sarah could barely look at her own neighbors when they brought covered dishes to the house, silently wondering if the person standing on her front porch was the exact monster who had stolen her beautiful daughter. But as the detectives meticulously tore through the backgrounds of the inner circle, the entire theory completely, frustratingly collapsed. Every single person they investigated possessed a completely flawless, airtight alibi for the exact hour Claire had vanished outside the convenience store. The fellow officers were heavily documented on their patrol shifts. The teachers were heavily confirmed to be leading after-school programs. The neighbors were captured on bank cameras or heavily vouched for by completely independent witnesses. Not a single person in the trusted circle had the unaccounted time required to orchestrate a massive, flawless abduction, plan a backpack miles away, and swap vehicles at a commuter lot. The investigation slammed into another massive, unyielding brick wall. The invisible phantom had completely slipped through their fingers once again. As the bitter, freezing winter completely buried the town of Elmwood in heavy snow, the massive momentum of the search slowly began to fade. The state police were eventually forced to reassign their senior detectives to newer, more active cases. The massive command center was completely dismantled, leaving Daniel entirely alone with his empty evidence boards and his profound, unending grief. And then, nearly 6 agonizing months after Claire disappeared, a sudden, explosive phone call completely resurrected the desperate hope of the Mercer family. A county sheriff from a neighboring jurisdiction, located nearly 50 miles away, called Daniel directly. The sheriff sounded incredibly optimistic. He reported that a local truck driver had spotted a teenage girl wandering completely alone near a massive, busy interstate truck stop. The local deputies had gently brought the girl into the station. She matched Claire's physical description absolutely perfectly. She was 16 years old, she had long dark hair, she was the exact same height, and she was even wearing a light blue denim jacket similar to the one Claire had worn on her birthday. The girl was deeply terrified, completely refusing to speak to the deputies or give them her real name. The sheriff told Daniel to come immediately. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. A massive, overwhelming surge of pure, blinding hope violently completely consumed Daniel and Sarah. They aggressively grabbed their winter coats and practically ran to their vehicle. Daniel drove his police cruiser at over 90 miles an hour down the frozen interstate, his emergency lights completely flashing, his hand gripping Sarah's trembling fingers the entire way. They were finally going to bring their little girl home. The 6 months of absolute, suffocating nightmare were finally, completely over. Daniel threw the cruiser into park outside the neighboring county precinct and rushed through the heavy glass doors, holding his wife's hand. The local sheriff smiled warmly and pointed toward a quiet, secure holding room down the hallway. Daniel's heart was pounding a frantic, deafening rhythm against his chest. He reached out and gently pushed the heavy wooden door open. Sitting on a small metal bench, entirely wrapped in a heavy gray police blanket, was the teenage girl. She slowly turned her head and looked directly up at the doorway. Daniel completely froze. The massive, beautiful wave of hope violently, permanently shattered into a million jagged pieces. The girl had dark hair. She was wearing a denim jacket, but her eyes were completely different. The shape of her face was entirely unfamiliar. It was absolutely not Claire. It was another missing teenage runaway from a different state, a deeply troubled girl who simply bore a massive, highly unfortunate physical resemblance to the police chief's daughter. Sarah let out a raw, agonizing scream that echoed completely down the quiet police hallway. She violently collapsed against Daniel's chest, weeping with a profound, entirely uncontrollable devastation. The psychological whiplash of believing their daughter was safe, only to have her violently, completely stolen away again by a simple mistake of identity, was absolutely catastrophic. Daniel held his deeply broken wife, the heavy tears finally spilling completely over his own weathered cheeks. He apologized softly to the terrified runaway girl, quietly closed the heavy wooden door, and slowly walked his weeping wife back out into the freezing parking lot. That heartbreaking, devastating mistake of identity completely crushed the remaining spirit of the Mercer family. When they returned to Elmwood, the massive, suffocating silence of their empty house finally broke them. The toxic, heavy weight of the unsolved mystery completely poisoned their lives. Sarah could no longer bear to walk past Claire's empty bedroom. She could no longer look at Daniel without seeing the massive, exhausting failure of a police chief who could not even protect his own child. A year later, their marriage quietly, completely fell apart. Sarah packed her bags and moved away to live with her sister in another state, entirely unable to survive the constant ghosts of Elmwood. Daniel was left completely, entirely alone. He became deeply, unhealthily obsessed with the case. He completely alienated his old friends, entirely refusing to talk about anything other than the missing evidence. His massive dedication to his job completely eroded. He spent his days sitting in his dark office, endlessly rereading the exact same witness statements, desperately trying to find the tiny, microscopic detail he had missed. But the case was completely, entirely cold. Eventually, the city council gently but firmly pressured Daniel to step down. The town needed a police chief who was focused on the present, not permanently trapped in the past. Daniel accepted an early retirement, completely surrendering the heavy silver badge he had worn with absolute pride for decades. He moved into a smaller, deeply isolated house on the edge of the town. He became an absolute ghost, entirely forgotten by a world that had relentlessly moved on. The missing person flyers featuring Claire's beautiful, smiling face slowly faded in the harsh sun, peeling entirely away from the storefront windows. As the long, heavy years slowly completely passed, the absolute truth of what happened on that quiet autumn afternoon seemed entirely destined to remain permanently buried in the dark. But as Daniel sat alone in his dark living room, staring endlessly at the copy of the anonymous letter, a highly disturbing, massive realization began to slowly form in his brilliant, exhausted mind. The detectives had completely cleared the trusted inner circle, because everyone possessed a flawless alibi for the exact hour Claire vanished outside the store. But the terrifying truth about perfect alibis is that they are entirely reliant on the exact, rigid timeline established by the police. If Claire had not been violently abducted exactly at 4:45 when she walked off the camera frame, if she had willingly gotten into a vehicle and driven away completely unharmed, then the actual, violent crime had not occurred at the convenience store. The true nightmare had happened hours later, in a completely different location, long after the initial timeline had ended. And if the crime happened hours later, then every single perfect alibi provided by the trusted inner circle was absolutely, fundamentally useless. The monster had not outsmarted the massive police investigation. They had simply hidden perfectly in plain sight, completely protected by a timeline that was entirely wrong. But without a single piece of physical evidence to prove where Claire went after she entered the sedan, Daniel was completely powerless to expose the phantom who had destroyed his life. 19 long, agonizing years passed. The world completely modernized, leaving the analog era of the 1990s entirely in the dust. The town of Elmwood continued to grow. The old convenience store was eventually torn down to build a modern pharmacy, and the teenagers who had attended high school with Claire Mercer became adults with children of their own. The disappearance of the police chief's daughter became one of the oldest, most famous unsolved cold cases in the entire history of Ohio. The media coverage had long since faded, and almost everyone in the state completely assumed that the absolute truth had permanently died with the passage of time. Daniel Mercer was now a heavily grayed, deeply weathered man approaching his late 60s. His face was profoundly lined with nearly 2 decades of unrelenting exhaustion and suffocating heartbreak. He lived completely alone in a small, quiet house, spending his days endlessly driving the rural county roads, still desperately searching for a daughter he knew in his soul was never coming home. But on a completely ordinary, quiet Tuesday morning, a massive, highly unexpected confession would violently resurrect the 19-year-old nightmare, proving that the absolute truth was never dead. It had simply been hiding in plain sight. In a sterile, quiet room at the local county hospital, a 70-year-old woman named Linda Brooks was sitting in a medical chair. Linda was a retired 911 emergency operator who had worked for the county dispatch center for over 30 years. She had recently received a severe, highly aggressive terminal medical diagnosis. She knew she only had a few weeks left to live. And she knew she absolutely could not take her massive, terrifying secret to the grave. Linda demanded that the hospital nurses contact the state police cold case unit, and she specifically requested that former police chief Daniel Mercer be brought to her room. When Daniel and a senior state detective walked quietly into the hospital room, Linda looked at the broken father, the heavy tears openly spilling over her deeply wrinkled cheeks. She confessed a secret she had carried in absolute, suffocating silence for 19 years. Linda revealed that on the exact night Claire disappeared in 1996, an emergency 911 call had briefly reached her heavy analog console. But because of a massive technical malfunction in the aging county routing system, the call had abruptly disconnected before it was officially logged into the master recording server. The official system completely missed it, Linda wept, her hands trembling violently against the hospital blankets. It was entirely wiped from the official police records, but my specific terminal had a running analog backup recorder, a physical cassette tape. Linda explained that she had listened to the damaged backup tape later that night. Something about the completely terrified, whispering voice on the recording had absolutely haunted her soul. She knew she should have immediately turned the tape over to the investigating detectives. But I was completely terrified, Linda choked out, hiding her face in her hands. I had broken strict department protocol by listening to the backup tapes on my own. I was a single mother. I was terrified that if I admitted I possessed unofficial, unlogged emergency audio from the most high-profile case in the state, I would be immediately fired, stripped of my pension, and possibly facing criminal obstruction charges. I panicked. I took the tape home and I completely hid it. For 19 years, she had allowed the Mercer family to suffer in the dark simply to protect her own career. Linda pointed a trembling finger toward her small purse resting on the hospital table. The state detective carefully opened the purse. Resting at the bottom was a completely faded, deeply worn analog cassette tape. Daniel stared at the small plastic object, his entire body shaking with a massive, explosive surge of pure adrenaline. The missing piece of the 19-year-old timeline had completely surfaced. The heavy, fragile cassette tape was aggressively rushed under heavy state police guard to a highly advanced, secure audio forensics laboratory. Because the magnetic tape was nearly 2 decades old and heavily degraded, the technicians had to move with absolute, flawless precision to prevent it from permanently snapping. Daniel stood in the soundproof observation room, his heart pounding a frantic, completely deafening rhythm. He watched through the glass as the audio engineers carefully ran the analog tape through massive, state-of-the-art digital filters, completely stripping away the heavy, hissing white static. After several grueling hours, the lead audio engineer signaled that they had successfully recovered the missing seconds of audio. Daniel put on a pair of heavy headphones. The quiet room was completely filled with the sound of static, and then, completely breaking through the noise, was a voice. It was a young, terrified whisper. "I don't think he knows I'm calling." Daniel completely collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands, weeping with a raw, agonizing devastation. There was absolutely no mistaking it. Even heavily distorted by 19 years of static, it was Claire's voice. She was completely alive, sitting inside a moving vehicle with her abductor, secretly using an early mobile phone to desperately dial for help. But before the 911 operator on the tape could answer, another voice broke through the audio. It was the calm, completely controlled voice of an adult male. The voice did not sound panicked. It did not sound angry. It was chillingly quiet. "Hang up," the adult male said. The line immediately died in a sharp click of static. The terrifying audio confirmed that Claire was not violently grabbed off the street by a screaming maniac. She was sitting next to a man she entirely believed she was safe with, until the terrifying moment she realized she was not being allowed to leave the vehicle. But the most critical piece of evidence recovered from the audio was not the voices. It was the background noise. The modern forensic audio specialists isolated a very faint, deeply rhythmic ringing sound playing softly behind Claire's terrified whisper. In 1996, the analog technology would have completely dismissed it as simple radio interference. But the advanced digital software completely mapped the acoustic frequency. It was a railroad crossing bell. The predator's vehicle was stopped, or driving incredibly slowly, near an active train crossing when Claire secretly made the call. State investigators aggressively pulled the 19-year-old municipal traffic maps for Elmwood and the surrounding counties. They mapped the exact radius of cell towers that could have possibly routed a mobile call to Linda's specific dispatch console on that autumn evening. The geographic search narrowed the possible locations down to just 3 active railroad crossings. Detectives then heavily subpoenaed the heavily archived commercial freight logs from the National Railway Company for that exact date. They found a massive, completely undeniable hit. At exactly 6:15 in the evening, just over an hour after Claire left the convenience store, a massive, slow-moving commercial freight train had experienced a mechanical delay. It had completely blocked one specific rural railroad crossing for nearly 20 agonizing minutes. Someone had been trapped there. The predator had been forced to stop his vehicle, waiting for the train to pass. And during that massive delay, Claire had secretly reached for the phone. The investigation violently shifted its massive focus directly to that specific rural railroad crossing. Detectives aggressively searched the old, dusty boxes containing the physical evidence collected from that specific sector during the initial 1996 search. They were desperately looking for anyone who had been officially documented near that crossing on the night of the disappearance. A young detective found a highly specific, deeply buried piece of paper. It was a faded gas station receipt retrieved during a neighborhood canvass. The receipt had been printed at a small, rural fuel station located less than a mile from the blocked railroad crossing, heavily time-stamped, just 15 minutes after the freight train had cleared the tracks. The credit card, used to purchase the fuel, belonged to a man named Marcus Vance. Daniel recognized the name immediately. Marcus Vance was a highly respected, deeply trusted local volunteer firefighter. He was a man who had actively, loudly participated in the massive civilian search parties looking for Claire. He had marched shoulder to shoulder with Daniel through the freezing woods. The terrifying reality violently washed over the command center. If the firefighter was the monster, he had completely embedded himself directly inside the police investigation, using his trusted uniform and his active participation to entirely mask his guilt. Heavily armed state police tactical units quietly surrounded the firefighter's home. Detectives knocked on the door and firmly escorted Marcus Vance into an unmarked cruiser, bringing him directly to the state precinct for aggressive interrogation. Daniel stood behind the two-way glass, his eyes burning with absolute, massive fury, staring at the man he completely believed had stolen his daughter. But as the senior detectives aggressively interrogated the volunteer firefighter, the explosive momentum of the investigation hit another devastating, completely frustrating brick wall. Marcus Vance did not demand a lawyer. He did not look panicked. He completely, calmly cooperated with every single question. He admitted that he was absolutely near the railroad crossing that evening, but he insisted he was not driving a dark sedan, and he had absolutely never seen Claire Mercer. "I was driving my heavy red pickup truck," Marcus explained, deeply confused by the aggressive questioning. "I was on my way home from a firehouse training shift. The crossing was completely blocked by the train. While I was waiting, I saw a woman whose old station wagon had completely stalled on the shoulder of the road. I pulled over to help her jumpstart her battery. That's why I stopped for fuel down the street a few minutes later." The detectives aggressively demanded the name of the stranded woman. Marcus provided it immediately. Within hours, investigators tracked down the elderly woman Marcus had helped. She completely, flawlessly corroborated his entire story. She swore that the volunteer firefighter was driving a red truck, that he had spent 20 minutes helping her fix her battery, and that he was completely alone the entire time. Marcus Vance had an absolute, airtight alibi. He had receipts, he had completely independent witnesses, and he had absolutely no criminal history. He had genuinely just been a helpful citizen trapped in the wrong place at the wrong time. The massive theory completely collapsed. Marcus was officially cleared and released. The investigation stalled completely. The invisible phantom had slipped away yet again, completely hidden behind the dark shadows of the 19-year-old timeline. Daniel sat in the empty command center late that night, the heavy, suffocating despair completely washing over him. They had the audio. They had the exact location of the railroad crossing, but they still had absolutely no idea who was driving the vehicle. Driven by pure, absolute desperation, Daniel refused to go home. He began aggressively tearing through the dusty cardboard boxes containing the hundreds of old, unprocessed photographs taken by crime scene technicians and neighborhood canvassers in 1996. He was looking for any vehicle, any tiny detail near the convenience store or the railroad crossing that had been completely overlooked. Near the bottom of the third box, Daniel found a thick manila envelope labeled Discarded Visuals. Inside the envelope were several highly blurred, deeply grainy photographs taken from a bank ATM camera located completely across the street from the Elmwood convenience store. During the initial investigation, the old analog cameras were deemed entirely too blurry to provide any useful evidence, and the photographs were simply tossed into the box and forgotten. Before we continue, if you want more emotional cold case stories like this, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Daniel stared at one specific photograph. It captured the edge of the street exactly around the time Claire had vanished. In the deep, blurry background, a dark sedan was partially visible, pulling away from the curb. Daniel aggressively rushed the photograph to the modern digital enhancement laboratory. He demanded that the technicians use the exact same advanced software they used to clean the audio recording to clear the massive visual pixelation. The technicians spent hours running the image through heavy digital filters, slowly sharpening the edges of the vehicle. They could not see the license plate. They could not see the face of the driver. But as the rear window of the dark sedan slowly came into sharp, digital focus, a massive, absolutely horrifying new detail completely shattered the entire psychological profile of the case. Daniel stared at the glowing computer screen, his blood turning completely to ice. Sitting in the back seat of the dark sedan, completely visible through the enhanced window, was the highly distinct, heavily padded outline of a child safety seat. Someone else was already inside that vehicle. The terrifying reality violently, completely crashed over Daniel's mind. Claire had not just willingly entered a vehicle with an adult she trusted. She had entered a vehicle that was actively carrying an infant or a small toddler. A teenager who loved children like Claire would absolutely never hesitate to accept a ride from a trusted adult driving a baby. The child safety seat provided the ultimate, flawless psychological camouflage for a predator. It made the situation look entirely safe, completely domestic, and absolutely harmless. But it also meant that the monster was not a solitary, isolated drifter. The kidnapper was someone who either had a young child of their own or was actively transporting a child on that specific evening. The massive scope of the investigation aggressively pivoted once again. They were no longer just looking for a man driving a dark sedan. They were hunting for a ghost who was traveling with a baby. The final, absolute truth was finally hovering just out of reach, completely hidden behind a terrifying web of suburban secrets, waiting for the heavy, 19-year-old silence to finally break. The discovery of the child safety seat completely altered the entire psychological landscape of the investigation. Daniel Mercer stood in the digital forensic laboratory, staring at the enhanced outline in the back window of the dark sedan. The presence of a child seat meant the monster was not a solitary, isolated drifter hunting in the dark. It meant the predator possessed a highly domesticated, deeply trustworthy facade. A 16-year-old girl like Claire, who loved children and babysat for the neighborhood, would never hesitate to accept a ride from a familiar adult driving a family vehicle. It was the absolute perfect camouflage. The massive weight of the state police investigation aggressively pivoted back to the rural railroad crossing. If the dark sedan was trapped there, and the volunteer firefighter Marcus Vance was also trapped there in his red truck, the detectives desperately wondered if the two vehicles were somehow connected. Investigators decided to aggressively tear into the deeply private, completely hidden personal life of Marcus Vance from 1996. What they discovered was a massive, completely heartbreaking secret that the firefighter and his wife had successfully hidden from almost everyone in Elmwood. Medical records from the autumn of 1996 revealed that Marcus's wife had been secretly pregnant. The couple was entirely overjoyed, silently preparing a nursery and purchasing baby supplies, including a child safety seat for her dark-colored vehicle. But just 3 weeks before Claire Mercer disappeared, Marcus's wife suffered a sudden, devastating late-term miscarriage. The profound, suffocating grief completely paralyzed the couple. They had hidden their massive loss from the community, entirely unable to speak about the tragedy. The theory among the desperate detectives shifted dramatically. Could the grieving wife have suffered a massive, catastrophic psychological break? Could she have seen a beautiful, vibrant teenage girl and completely snapped, forcing her into the vehicle? The state police quietly, gently brought the firefighter's wife into the precinct. They tested her DNA against the microscopic traces found on Claire's abandoned bicycle. They aggressively audited her exact movements on the night of the disappearance. The results were completely, undeniably definitive. The DNA did not match. Her alibi for that evening was absolutely flawless. The grieving woman had absolutely nothing to do with the missing police chief's daughter. The presence of a child seat in her vehicle was nothing more than a profound, tragic coincidence. The investigation slammed into another massive, devastating dead end. Daniel felt the heavy, suffocating darkness completely wrapping around his mind once again. They were chasing shadows, completely paralyzed by the 19-year gap in the evidence. A few days later, Daniel received an urgent phone call from the county hospital. Linda Brooks, the retired 911 operator who had saved the damaged cassette tape, was rapidly failing. The doctors did not expect her to survive the night. Daniel immediately drove to the hospital and walked into the quiet, dimly lit medical room. Linda was incredibly frail, her breathing heavy and shallow. When she saw the former police chief walk into the room, she reached out her trembling, fragile hand. Daniel sat in the chair beside her bed and gently held her fingers. "I am so sorry, Daniel," Linda whispered, her voice barely a breath in the quiet room. "I should have given you the tape 19 years ago. I was just so terrified." Daniel squeezed her hand gently. He did not harbor any anger toward the dying woman. Her brave confession had completely resurrected the search for his daughter. He told her she was forgiven. But Linda shook her head, the heavy tears pooling in her faded eyes. She told Daniel that there was one tiny, microscopic detail she had never included in her official police confession. A detail that the heavy static on the digital recording had completely masked, but a detail that her highly trained human ears had caught on that fateful night. When Claire whispered into the phone, Linda choked out, struggling for breath. She wasn't crying. She wasn't sobbing or screaming in absolute terror. Daniel leaned forward, completely frozen. "She sounded profoundly confused," Linda explained, her eyes locking directly onto Daniel. "She was whispering because she didn't want the driver to hear her, but she spoke like she knew him perfectly well. It was exactly like she couldn't understand why he was driving past her house. She completely trusted him, Daniel. She didn't realize she was in danger until it was entirely too late." The line immediately died, just like the hope in Daniel's chest. Claire wasn't abducted, she was betrayed. Daniel left the hospital with a massive, burning fire completely consuming his soul. The monster was not a stranger with a fake child seat. The monster was someone Claire implicitly, completely trusted. He drove directly to the State Police Command Center and ordered the detectives to completely tear up the suspect board. They were going to aggressively re-examine every single adult who held a position of absolute trust in Claire's life. Teachers, high school coaches, church volunteers, neighbors. They cross-referenced the names against the geographic locations of the convenience store, the isolated bridge where the backpack was found, and the blocked railroad crossing. As the massive computer system processed thousands of old files, one highly specific name quietly, repeatedly began appearing near multiple pieces of forgotten evidence. A respected local youth counselor named Nathan Cole. Nathan had been a deeply beloved figure in the Elmwood community in 1996. He organized massive neighborhood charity events, led the local youth group, and was heavily trusted by dozens of families. Claire had attended his youth programs for years. But the most chilling detail was Nathan's behavior immediately after the disappearance. When the entire state mobilized to search for the police chief's daughter, Nathan Cole had been one of the absolute loudest, most aggressive civilian volunteers. He had organized search grids. He had printed hundreds of missing person flyers. He had stood directly next to Daniel in the freezing woods, loudly demanding justice and praying for Claire's safe return. The detectives aggressively pulled Nathan's background file. On the surface, it appeared completely spotless. He had absolutely no criminal history, no history of violence, and no red flags in his employment records. But when the forensic accountants aggressively tore into his 19-year-old financial records, they discovered a massive, completely terrifying anomaly. Less than a year after Claire completely vanished, Nathan Cole had abruptly liquidated his local bank accounts. He had quietly quit his highly respected job as a youth counselor, packed up his house, and completely fled the state of Ohio. He had moved several states away, completely changing his career and cutting all ties with his former life. Because he was so deeply loved and universally trusted by the town, absolutely no one had ever questioned why he suddenly left. They simply assumed the tragic disappearance of one of his favorite youth group members had completely broken his heart, forcing him to seek a fresh start. The phantom was finally completely exposed in the bright light. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Daniel and Detective Vance immediately boarded a direct flight to the southern state where Nathan Cole had relocated. They did not coordinate with the local authorities. They wanted to knock on his door completely unannounced, entirely removing his ability to prepare a fake narrative. They drove a quiet rental car into a beautiful, sunny suburban neighborhood and parked outside Nathan's home. When they knocked on the front door, Nathan answered. He was now in his early 50s, his hair heavily grayed, but he still possessed the exact same warm, disarming smile that had made him so incredibly trusted in Elmwood. When he saw former police chief Daniel Mercer standing on his porch, Nathan did not look panicked. He did not try to slam the door. He looked deeply surprised, but he immediately invited the two men into his comfortable living room. Nathan was incredibly cooperative. He offered them coffee. He sat on the sofa and looked Daniel directly in the eyes, expressing his profound, unending sorrow that Claire had never been found. When Detective Vance gently asked if Nathan would be willing to provide a voluntary DNA sample to help completely clear the old suspect lists, Nathan agreed without a single moment of hesitation. He held out his hand and allowed the detective to swab his cheek. He answered every single question perfectly. He spoke fondly of Claire's intelligence and her bright future. He provided his old alibis with flawless precision. Everything about his demeanor heavily suggested complete, absolute innocence. The state detective almost believed him. But investigators don't arrest people based on smiles. They arrest them based on lies. During the quiet, 2-hour interview, Detective Vance casually asked Nathan about the vehicles he had owned back in 1996, mentioning that the police were still trying to track down a few old sedans seen in the neighborhood. Nathan shook his head calmly. "I never owned a dark sedan," Nathan claimed, his voice perfectly steady. "I drove a silver coupe for years. I didn't buy a larger car until I moved down here." It was a tiny, microscopic detail, but it was a complete, absolute lie. Before flying down for the interview, the forensic accountants had aggressively subpoenaed the heavily archived, 19-year-old state auto insurance records from Ohio. The official, undeniable state documents proved that in the autumn of 1996, Nathan Cole was the registered owner of a dark blue, 4-door sedan. And the massive, horrifying icing on the cake was the specific date he had removed the vehicle from his insurance policy. Nathan had completely sold the dark blue sedan to a massive, out-of-state scrap yard for pure cash exactly 3 weeks after Claire Mercer had vanished. He had completely destroyed the vehicle before the police ever even thought to look at him. The lie completely shattered his flawless facade. He had placed himself directly inside the crosshairs of the investigation. But a lie about a car is not enough to convict a man of a 19-year-old disappearance. They desperately needed absolute, undeniable physical evidence linking Nathan directly to Claire on the night she vanished. Daniel and Detective Vance aggressively flew back to Ohio. They ordered the state laboratory to completely reopen the heavily sealed physical evidence boxes containing the green canvas backpack found beneath the isolated bridge. The backpack had been meticulously preserved in a climate-controlled evidence locker for 19 years. During the initial investigation, forensic technology was heavily limited, but modern science possessed the incredible ability to find microscopic ghosts. Forensic technicians aggressively vacuumed every single square inch of the heavy canvas fabric, placing the tiny, invisible particles under a massive electron microscope. They were desperately looking for a hair, a skin cell, or a drop of sweat. After 48 grueling hours, the lead forensic scientist called Daniel into the sterile laboratory. They had found something completely undeniable. Deeply embedded inside the heavy fabric of the backpack strap was a single, microscopic strand of pet hair. The technicians had completely extracted the genetic material from the root of the hair. It did not belong to a dog, and it absolutely did not belong to the Mercer family, who had never owned any pets due to Sarah's severe allergies. The DNA profile completely matched a highly specific, very rare breed of long-haired gray Persian cat. Detective Vance immediately pulled the deeply archived, 19-year-old veterinary records for the town of Elmwood. The records completely confirmed the massive, devastating truth. In 1996, Nathan Cole was the registered owner of an incredibly rare, expensive long-haired gray Persian cat. The microscopic strand of animal hair had completely transferred from Nathan's clothing, or from the upholstery of his dark blue sedan, directly onto Claire's backpack on the night he placed it in the mud beneath the bridge to completely derail the massive police search. It was the very first piece of undeniable, absolute physical evidence, linking a specific human being to Claire Mercer in 19 long, agonizing years. Daniel stood in the bright, sterile laboratory, his massive hands trembling violently, his chest heaving with heavy, shallow breaths. The phantom who had stolen his little girl, who had stood next to him in the freezing woods and loudly prayed for her return, was finally entirely exposed. The 19-year-old silence was completely over. Daniel and Detective Vance immediately secured a high-risk federal arrest warrant. A massive convoy of heavily armed tactical vehicles and federal agents began moving silently into position around Nathan Cole's quiet suburban house several states away. The net was completely drawn. The monster was completely trapped, and the absolute, horrifying truth of exactly what had happened to the police chief's daughter inside that dark sedan was finally about to be dragged violently into the bright light. The heavy, quiet morning air of the southern suburb was completely shattered by the massive, overwhelming presence of federal law enforcement. Heavily armed tactical teams moved silently across the pristine green lawn of Nathan Cole's beautiful house, completely surrounding every single door and window. There was absolutely no room for error. The ghost who had successfully hidden behind a warm smile and a trusted reputation for 19 years was finally completely trapped. At exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, the heavy front door was violently breached. Federal agents flooded into the living room, their weapons raised, loudly demanding complete compliance. Nathan Cole did not fight. He did not run toward the back door. He was standing in the kitchen, wearing a simple bathrobe, entirely frozen. He slowly raised his empty hands into the air, completely surrendering to the massive, inevitable reality that his completely fabricated life was finally over. He was heavily shackled in steel handcuffs and quietly escorted out to a waiting federal vehicle. A few hours later, Nathan sat inside a cold, sterile interrogation room at the local FBI field office. Daniel Mercer stood in the dark observation room, his hands pressed tightly against the two-way glass. He stared at the man who had completely destroyed his family, his marriage, and his career. Daniel expected to see a cold, remorseless monster, but as Detective Vance sat down at the metal table across from Nathan, the former youth counselor simply looked incredibly, profoundly exhausted. Detective Vance did not play any games. He immediately dropped the massive, heavily detailed physical evidence directly onto the table. He showed Nathan the heavily enhanced photograph of the child safety seat in the dark blue sedan. He presented the 19-year-old insurance documents proving Nathan had sold that exact vehicle for pure cash just weeks after the disappearance. And finally, Vance slid the highly classified forensic report across the table, completely detailing the microscopic Persian cat hair, found deeply embedded in the canvas strap of Claire's abandoned backpack. Nathan stared at the paper. The completely flawless, airtight lie he had maintained for nearly 2 decades violently collapsed. He closed his eyes, and a massive, heavy tear slowly tracked down his deeply weathered face. He completely broke down, his shoulders shaking with a profound, suffocating agony. "I never wanted to hurt her," Nathan wept, his voice cracking into a raw, heavy whisper. "I swear to God, Daniel, I absolutely never intended to hurt your daughter." Knowing that the former police chief was listening through the glass, Nathan slowly, agonizingly confessed the absolute, completely horrifying truth of exactly what happened on that quiet autumn afternoon. It was not a heavily planned, completely calculated kidnapping. It was a massive, devastating chain reaction triggered entirely by one single moment of absolute panic. Nathan explained that Claire had indeed gone to the convenience store to buy the sparkling cider for her birthday dinner, but while she was walking out, she had used the outdoor payphone to call her best friend. They had gotten into a severe, highly emotional argument about a boy at school. Claire was deeply upset, crying, and she didn't want to ride her bicycle home while her face was completely red with tears. She wanted to calm down before walking into her family birthday party. So she called the one adult she implicitly, completely trusted outside of her own parents. She called her youth counselor, Nathan Cole. Nathan had driven his dark blue sedan to the store and completely willingly picked her up. Claire had left her bicycle resting against the brick wall, intending to pick it up later that evening. She climbed into the passenger seat, completely relaxed and entirely feeling safe. "I was just going to drive her around the block and let her vent," Nathan cried, wiping his eyes with his trembling hands. "But I had forgotten my heavy jacket at my house, and the car heater was broken. I told her we were just going to swing by my place for 2 minutes so I could grab my coat, and then I would drive her straight home to her birthday dinner." When they pulled into Nathan's driveway, he ran inside. Claire stayed in the car, but a few minutes later, needing to use the restroom, she stepped out of the sedan and walked into his house. She walked down the quiet hallway, looking for the bathroom, but she accidentally opened the wrong door. She opened the door to the spare guest bedroom. When Claire looked inside, she saw something she was absolutely, strictly never supposed to see. Hiding quietly in the dark bedroom was a deeply terrified 14-year-old girl and her young, 7-year-old brother. They were heavily bruised, incredibly malnourished, and completely hiding in absolute terror. Nathan rushed into the hallway and completely panicked. He frantically pushed Claire back toward the front door, deeply terrified that the brilliant 16-year-old girl would immediately tell her powerful police chief father exactly what she had seen. "They were runaways," Nathan sobbed, completely burying his face in his handcuffed hands. "I had met the teenage girl at a youth conference in another state. Her father was a violent, absolute monster. He beat them relentlessly. The local police in that state completely refused to arrest him because he was wealthy. The girl begged me to save them, so I completely broke the law. I drove across state lines, took the kids, and hid them in my house. I was trying to find a safe, completely underground family to take them in." Nathan had completely crossed the line from a trusted counselor to a vigilante harboring fugitive children. And because he was using a massive child safety seat in the back of his car to transport the 7-year-old boy, the vehicle looked entirely domestic and safe to anyone looking from the outside. "I knew that if Claire told Daniel, my entire life would be completely destroyed," Nathan cried. "I would be arrested for federal kidnapping. I would go to federal prison. But worse, the children would be immediately placed into the system and sent directly back to the violent monster who was trying to kill them. I couldn't let that happen. I had to convince her to stay completely quiet." Nathan aggressively forced Claire back into the dark sedan. He locked the heavy doors and drove wildly away from his house, heading toward the rural edge of town. Claire was incredibly smart, and she was completely terrified by the sudden, massive panic in her trusted counselor's eyes. As Nathan drove, desperately begging her not to say a word, Claire quietly, secretly reached into her backpack. She pulled out the heavy, early-model mobile phone her father had given her for emergencies. She secretly dialed 911, holding the phone completely hidden against her leg. But Nathan heard the faint, tiny beep of the keypad. He looked over and saw the phone. He completely snapped. "Hang up," Nathan commanded, his voice completely cold with absolute terror. Claire dropped the phone. Just moments later, the heavy flashing lights of the rural railroad crossing dropped down, entirely blocking the dark road. A massive commercial freight train slowly roared across the tracks. Nathan was completely trapped. In that single, chaotic moment, Claire saw her absolute only chance. She violently threw the passenger door open, completely abandoning her backpack on the floorboard. She jumped out of the running vehicle and sprinted desperately into the dense, dark, freezing woods bordering the railroad tracks. Nathan jumped out and aggressively chased her into the darkness. He searched for nearly an hour, screaming her name, but the dense brush and the pitch-black night completely swallowed her. "I couldn't find her," Nathan wept, completely devastated. "I assumed she had run to a nearby house or made it back to the main road. I drove home, completely terrified that the police were coming to arrest me. But when the massive news broke later that night that she was completely missing, I realized she had never made it out of those woods." Terrified that the police would immediately assume he had brutally murdered the chief's daughter, Nathan made the absolutely worst, most catastrophic decision of his entire life. Instead of calling the police and leading them to the woods where she might still be wandering, injured and freezing, he chose to completely protect himself and the runaway children. He drove to the convenience store, grabbed her house keys from her abandoned backpack, walked through the Mercer house to steal phrases for the fake letter, and then planted the bag in the mud beneath the isolated bridge completely across town to deliberately derail the massive search grid. He sold the car, moved the hidden children to a safe location out of state, and completely abandoned Claire to the dark. He allowed the entire country to completely believe that the police chief's daughter had vanished forever. Daniel Mercer stood in the observation room, completely unable to breathe. The massive, horrifying truth completely broke his heart into a million pieces. His beautiful, intelligent daughter was not abducted in a planned attack. She had run into the freezing woods, completely alone and entirely terrified, while the man who chased her deliberately sent the police miles away in the wrong direction. Daniel immediately ordered the state police to aggressively mobilize a massive, heavily armed search team. They flew directly back to Ohio and drove straight to the specific rural railroad crossing, where the freight train had stopped 19 years ago. During the initial 1996 investigation, the massive, dense woods bordering that specific section of the train tracks had never been completely searched. The land belonged to a deeply stubborn, wealthy private property owner who had absolutely refused to let the police heavily trample his property without a highly specific geographic warrant. Because the police had been entirely focused on the fake evidence beneath the bridge across town, they had simply bypassed the private woods. But with Nathan's confession, they finally had the absolute, undeniable probable cause. Heavy state excavators and dozens of forensic technicians wearing bright yellow vests aggressively tore into the thick, overgrown brush. They formed a massive, tightly linked grid, slowly walking through the dense trees, scanning the muddy ground with highly advanced metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar. Daniel marched at the very front of the line. He was an exhausted, heavily aged man, but he absolutely refused to let anyone else find his little girl. After 4 grueling, completely agonizing hours of searching, a state trooper near the edge of the line suddenly raised his hand and loudly blew his whistle. Daniel ran through the heavy brush, his heart completely pounding in his chest. The trooper was standing at the edge of a massive, incredibly steep, deeply hidden natural ravine. The heavy autumn leaves had completely camouflaged the dangerous drop over the years. Daniel carefully climbed down into the damp, freezing earth of the deep ravine. Resting quietly at the very bottom, completely covered by 19 years of thick, heavy soil and dark leaves, the forensic technicians found the fragile, heartbreaking remains. And resting perfectly intact near the center of the earth, catching the pale afternoon sunlight, was a small, familiar silver necklace. It was the exact necklace Claire had worn on her 16th birthday. Daniel fell completely to his knees in the cold mud. He gently touched the damp earth, weeping with a massive, entirely uncontrollable devastation that echoed completely through the quiet Ohio woods. The absolute, deeply tragic reality of Claire's final hours completely settled over the forensic team. She had successfully escaped the vehicle. She had run desperately through the pitch-black woods, completely fighting to survive. But in the absolute darkness, she had tragically, blindly fallen into the deep, hidden ravine. She had suffered a severe, completely immobilizing injury in the fall. She could not climb out. She was entirely trapped in the cold, dark earth. And while she lay there, desperately waiting for her father to come and save her, the massive, highly publicized rescue operation was completely, deliberately searching 10 miles away because of Nathan's fake evidence. She had survived the initial escape, but she had tragically, slowly lost her life completely alone in the freezing dark, entirely because the search teams unknowingly walked around the hidden ravine, but absolutely never inside it. The 19-year-old nightmare was finally, completely over. The absolute truth was completely exposed to the bright light, but the devastating emotional cost was entirely unmeasurable. A few months later, the heavy wooden gavel finally slammed down in the federal courthouse. Nathan Cole was officially sentenced to a massive, consecutive life sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary for severe kidnapping, obstruction of justice, and manslaughter. He wept openly as he was led away in heavy steel chains, finally forced to completely face the massive, terrifying consequences of the devastating panic that had destroyed an innocent family. The federal authorities also managed to quietly locate the two runaway children Nathan had hidden. They were now adults, living safely and peacefully under assumed names. The court completely protected their identities, honoring the massive, terrifying sacrifice Claire had unknowingly made. But the most completely haunting, deeply resonant tragedy of the entire legal process rested entirely on the shoulders of the retired 911 operator, Linda Brooks. Linda passed away in the county hospital just a few weeks after the massive search concluded. She died completely knowing that her single, deeply terrified decision to illegally hide the damaged cassette tape had completely prolonged the horrific agony of the Mercer family for nearly 2 decades. If she had bravely handed the tape to the police on the very first night, the massive search grid would have immediately targeted the railroad crossing. They would have secured the massive private woods. They would have absolutely found Claire in the ravine before the freezing temperatures completely claimed her life. Daniel Mercer spent his final years sitting quietly in his small, peaceful home. He finally brought Claire's remains back to a beautiful, sunlit cemetery in Elmwood, completely giving her the beautiful, heavily attended memorial service she so deeply deserved. He found a small, profound measure of peace in the absolute knowledge that his beautiful daughter had never stopped fighting. She had been incredibly brave. She had outsmarted her captor, successfully escaped the vehicle, and desperately tried to come home to the family she loved. The tragic story of the police chief's daughter stands as a chilling, profoundly devastating reminder that the most terrifying monsters in the world are rarely masked strangers hiding in the dark. They are often the incredibly trusted, smiling faces who allow absolute fear to completely override their morality. But far more importantly, It leaves a heavy, haunting message about the absolute, terrifying power of silence. One single moment of panic, one hidden recording, and one cowardly decision to protect a career over a life completely changed the destinies of countless people forever. The massive, beautiful light of the truth is the absolutely only thing that can conquer the shadows, proving that no matter how deep the woods are, and no matter how many years pass, the profound, unyielding love of a desperate family will always, eventually, completely bring their lost ones safely back into the light.